Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, join our membership. Sit back, relax, and sip your coffee. Enjoy. Teaching used to be my salvation. Back when I taught third grade in Billings, I'd wake up excited to see those little faces light up when they finally grasped a math concept or discovered the magic in a new book. I was born for this profession. Everyone said so. My classroom was always the messy one. Paint on the walls from art projects, plants growing in every corner, and the constant hum of eager voices discussing everything from dinosaurs to distant planets. That was before I took the position in Clearwater Falls. The move wasn't exactly voluntary. After my divorce finalized and Lisa took our house, I needed somewhere cheap to restart. My college buddy Jake had mentioned an opening at his hometown school. A place so remote that GPS apps sometimes just gave up halfway there. The pay was decent. The cost of living was practically nothing. And I figured a fresh start in Montana's wilderness might help me heal from the wreckage my life had become. Clearwater Falls sits nestled in the Whitefish Range, about 40 miles northwest of Columbia Falls. The town has maybe 800 residents on a good day, and the elementary school serves kids from an area spanning 3 counties. Most of the families work the ranches, the timber mill on Highway 93, or the handful of businesses that survive off tourists heading to Glacier National Park. The school building itself dates back to 1952, though they'd added a wing in the 80s. Red brick, narrow hallways, and that particular smell all old schools seem to share. Floor wax mixed with cafeteria food, and decades of children's laughter soaked into the walls. Principal Henderson gave me the tour my first week of August, pointing out the library with its collection of books that probably hadn't been updated since the Carter administration, and the gymnasium where the basketball hoops still had rope nets. "You'll be teaching the combined 4th and 5th grade class," Henderson had explained, jingling his keys as we walked. 23 kids total. Good bunch. Ranch kids mostly. They're independent and respectful, but they can be particular about how things are done around here. I should have asked what he meant by particular, but I was too busy noting the water stains on the ceiling tiles and wondering how many layers of paint covered the lockers. The classrooms had tall windows facing the mountains, and I remember thinking how perfect the view would be for inspiring young writers. The first few weeks went smoothly. The kids welcomed me with the easy friendliness that small-town children often possess. There was Emma Kowalski, whose family ran a cattle ranch near the Canadian border. Her desk was always organized with mechanical precision, and she had this habit of counting her pencils before and after every lesson. Tommy Blackfeet, whose grandfather taught traditional stories at the Cultural Center in Browning, could spell better than most high schoolers. Sarah Mitchell, daughter of the town's only dentist, who collected rocks and knew the geological history of every peak visible from our classroom windows. Then came late September, when Mrs. Albright pulled me aside after the Harvest Festival. Margaret Albright had taught at the school for 37 years before retiring. She was one of those teachers who seemed to know every child, every family, and every secret in town. Her gray hair was always pinned in a perfect bun, and her cardigans appeared to be from a collection she'd been building since the Reagan era. "Mr. Ellis," she'd said, glancing around the empty gymnasium where they were cleaning up from the festival, "we need to talk about certain protocols that weren't covered in your orientation." I remember laughing, thinking she meant some quirky small-town tradition. Maybe the kids caroled at Christmas, or there was a special way they celebrated the end of the school year. "It's about the children's safety," she continued, her voice dropping low. "There are things in this valley that outsiders don't understand, rules that must be followed." The way she said rules made something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't about no running in the hallways or using indoor voices during library time. What kind of rules, Mrs. Albright? She reached into her purse and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper, folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn soft. Every teacher before you has followed these. They're not suggestions, Mr. Ellis. They're requirements for survival, yours and the children's. I should have walked away. I should have asked for a transfer that very night. Instead, I took the paper, feeling how the edges had been handled by nervous fingers for God knows how many years. As I unfolded it, I caught a whiff of something like old books and lavender, mixed with an underlying scent I couldn't identify. Something earthy and wrong. The handwriting was faded, but still legible. Rules for teaching at Clearwater Falls Elementary. These must be obeyed. That night, I sat in my small apartment above Mabel's diner, reading and rereading those rules until my eyes burned. Some seemed harmless if odd. Others made my hands shake as I held the paper. I told myself it was just small-town superstition. Every community has its peculiarities, right? The farming towns I'd visited had their own weather predictions, their own sayings about when to plant or harvest. This was probably similar, local traditions that had grown strange in the telling over generations. But as October arrived and the mountains around us began their slow transformation into winter white, I started to notice things. Little things at first. The way certain children would freeze when they heard specific sounds. How the janitor, Mr. Peterson, never cleaned the building alone and always left before sunset. The persistent rumor among the kids about the shadow children who attended classes but weren't on any roster. And then there was Emma Kowalski's obsessive counting. I'd thought it was just a quirk, but watching her during our Halloween party, I realized she was counting her classmates. 23 students, every single time. But on some days, when the mountain shadows grew long across our classroom, I would count 24. That was when I started following the rules. The morning proceeded normally. Math worksheets, reading groups, a science lesson about rock formation that Sarah contributed to enthusiastically. But underneath the routine, I felt a current of awareness I hadn't noticed before. The children were more alert than typical 4th and 5th graders, scanning the windows frequently and falling silent when certain sounds echoed from the hallway. During lunch, I cornered Principal Henderson in his office. The space was cramped, filled with filing cabinets that looked like they predated the building itself, and a collection of world's best principal mugs that spoke to decades of Christmas gifts from students. I need to ask about these rules, I said, producing the paper. Henderson's face shifted, the friendly demeanor I'd grown accustomed to replaced by something more guarded. Ah, Margaret gave them to you. What I don't understand is why they're necessary. What are we protecting the children from? He leaned back in his chair, which protested with a long squeak. Outside his window, I could see the mountains rising stark against the October sky. This valley has always been unusual. Indigenous peoples avoided settling here permanently. They'd hunt, gather plants, but never built permanent camps. The first white settlers noted strange occurrences in their journals. Unexplained disappearances, voices in the wind, children who wandered into the forest and came back, different. You're talking about ghost stories. Am I? Henderson opened a desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder. These are incident reports from the past 40 years. Teachers who didn't follow the rules, children who ignored them. He flipped through yellowed pages. 1983. Teacher stayed after sunset with a student whose bus was late. Found 3 days later in the supply closet. No memory of what happened to the child. 1991. Janitor investigated singing in the music room. Hospitalized with severe psychological trauma. Still lives in the state facility in Warm Springs. The folder contained dozens of reports, police statements, hospital records. My skepticism began to crumble as I read names, dates, detailed accounts of events that couldn't be explained by small-town folklore. But why doesn't anyone leave? Why keep the school open? Henderson closed the folder carefully. Because running doesn't fix anything. The children need education, and we've learned to coexist safely. Those rules exist because people who came before us paid dearly to learn them. Each one represents someone's tragedy turned into wisdom. A knock on the door interrupted us. Mrs. Cooper, the office secretary, poked her head in. "Principal Henderson?" "The Kowalski girl is in the nurse's office. Says she can't count her classmates correctly." Henderson and I exchanged glances. He grabbed the folder, and we hurried down the hallway. In the nurse's office, Emma sat on the examination table, tears streaming down her face. "I keep counting wrong," she sobbed. "There are too many. There should be 23, but I keep finding 24. The nurse, a kind woman named Janet who'd been at the school almost as long as Mrs. Albright, knelt beside Emma's chair. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just breathe." "Where do you see the extra student?" Henderson asked gently. "By the windows. Always by the windows. They're wearing clothes like us, but they're not right. Their face keeps changing." I felt my mouth go dry. Henderson placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "Emma, this is important. Have you drawn any pictures lately? Any mountains?" She nodded miserably. "Last night, I kept drawing the same peak over and over. My mom threw them away, but I dreamed about it all night." Henderson and I looked at each other. Rule 4. "Which peak, Emma?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "Old Baldy, the one with the dead trees on top." She pointed through the nurse's office window, where the mountain in question rose like a gray fist against the sky. But in my dreams, there were children dancing around those trees, and they wanted me to join them. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall and Emma's quiet sniffles. I looked at the mountains visible through the window, at the dead trees crowning Old Baldy, and felt something inside me shift. These rules weren't superstition. They were survival instructions in a place where the boundary between the living and the dead had worn thin as tissue paper. "Emma," I said softly, "from now on, if you see that extra student again, you just look away. Count the clouds instead, or the desks, or anything else. Do you understand?" She nodded, wiping her nose with a tissue Janet handed her. As we walked back to class, Henderson stopped me in the hallway. "Mr. Ellis, I should mention, Rule 6 exists for a reason. If you acknowledge these extra children, they become more real, more dangerous. Pretending they aren't there is the only thing that keeps them from becoming permanent parts of our world." Back in my classroom, I found the students working quietly at their desks, but the atmosphere felt charged, like air before a storm. I counted them carefully. 23. But as the afternoon sun shifted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, I caught glimpses of movement that didn't match any living child. One shadow too many by the window. I looked away and began teaching the afternoon math lesson. My voice steady despite the fact that my hands were shaking as I wrote equations on the board. Some rules I was learning were written in blood and tragedy. Following them was the only thing standing between us, and something far worse than ignorance. The week following Emma's episode passed without incident, but I noticed changes in my awareness. Every shadow seemed suspect, every empty classroom a potential threat. I found myself counting students obsessively, and had begun carrying a digital voice recorder to document anything unusual, a habit that would prove more valuable than I initially realized. Friday afternoon brought the first snowfall of the season. Large, lazy flakes drifted past our windows as I taught the final lesson of the day. The children watched the snow with excitement, some already making plans for sledding and snowmen. I checked the clock. 3:15 p.m. 15 minutes until dismissal. "Miss Sarah," I said, "please collect the science workbooks while I—" A bout of children singing interrupted me. Not my students. They were all silently watching the snow. The melody drifted down from the second floor, sweet and clear and completely wrong. The words weren't quite English, weren't quite anything I recognized. My students froze. Emma's hand shot up. "Mr. Ellis," she whispered, "should we?" "No." I remembered Rule 2 crystal clear. "Everyone please take out your reading books. Silently." The singing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My students sat rigid in their seats, following my lead as I pulled out my lesson plan and pretended to review it. The melody twisted through the building's ventilation system, growing louder, more compelling. Tommy Blackfeet suddenly looked up. "Mr. Ellis, I need to use the bathroom." "Can you wait?" I asked, though I knew he probably could. "It's important," he said, and something in his voice made me look closer. His eyes were distant, unfocused. The singing seemed to pull at him like a physical force. "Tommy, stay in your seat. The singing will stop soon." "What singing?" Sarah asked, genuinely confused. "I don't hear anything." That's when I realized not all of the children heard it. Emma could hear it, her face pale with concentration as she stared at her desk. Tommy heard it too, but Sarah, the Fletcher twins, and several others seemed completely unaware. The melody faded gradually, leaving him silence that felt dangerous. I waited a full 5 minutes before speaking again. "All right, class. Dismissal in 5 minutes." After the last student left, I personally walked Tommy to his bus, keeping him firmly beside me. I found myself alone in the building with Mr. Peterson. I watched him work, noting how he kept glancing at the ceiling, at doors, at anything that might reveal the source of that singing. "You heard it too," I said. It wasn't a question. He paused in his mopping. "Been hearing it for 23 years. Started the day Mrs. Albright began working here." "What is it?" "Best guess? Children who got lost in the mountains, frozen to death looking for their way down." He wrung out his mop with more force than necessary. "They sing because they're trying to call other children to join them, make them less alone." I felt my stomach drop. Is that what happened? Children got lost? Winter of 1961, school field trip to see the old mining camps up near Glacier. Bus went off the road in a blizzard. 7 children never made it down the mountain. He resumed mopping, his movements quick and efficient. They found some of the bodies come spring. Others, well, you can't find what doesn't want to be found. That night, I researched everything I could about the 1961 incident. The microfilm archives at the county library painted a grim picture. The bus accident had occurred during an unexpected blizzard that dropped 2 feet of snow in 12 hours. Search and rescue teams found the overturned vehicle and most of the children, but 7 were missing. The official report listed them as presumed dead, but several witnesses claimed to have seen children playing in the woods during the search efforts, children who vanished when approached. The names burned into my memory. Michael Kowalski, Emma's uncle. Sarah Thompson, whose family had since moved away. David Fletcher, an ancestor of the twins in my class. Patricia Blackfeet, Tommy's great-aunt. And 3 others whose families still lived in the valley. As October faded into November, I faced my first real test. The morning after Halloween dawned gray and bitter, with snow falling steadily. I arrived at school to find caution tape across the second-floor stairway and a handwritten sign, "Supply closet off limits, November 1st, March 15th. Rule 3. I managed to avoid that entire floor for 2 weeks. I rearranged my classroom supplies, stocked up on necessities, and even borrowed materials from other teachers. But on November 15th, Emma accidentally spilled paint thinner on her science project, a carefully constructed volcano that was due the next day. "I need more cardboard," she said, tears in her eyes as she looked at the ruined project, the kind that's thick enough for the base. I knew exactly where the heavy cardboard was stored. Second-floor supply closet, the same closet that was now forbidden territory. "We'll find another solution," I told her, but after checking every accessible storage space in the building, I came up empty. The thin poster board from the first-floor supplies wouldn't support her project's weight. At 3:45 p.m., after all students and most staff had left, I found myself standing at the bottom of the second-floor stairway. The caution tape hung limp, almost inviting. What harm could there be in quickly grabbing supplies? I'd be in and out in minutes. The stairs creaked as I climbed, each step echoing in the empty hallway. The second floor felt different, colder, despite the heating system running normally. I reached the supply closet and tried the handle. Locked. I laughed, relief flooding through me. Problem solved. I couldn't break the rule if I couldn't get in. I turned to leave and noticed something strange. Wet footprints led from the closet door toward the far end of the hallway. Small footprints, like those a child might make. But the building had been empty when I arrived. I followed the prints, my heart rate increasing with each step. They led to the end of the hallway, where a large window overlooked the schoolyard. And there, pressed against the glass from the outside, were tiny handprints. 7 sets of handprints. The glass was completely fogged, but the prints showed clearly. Small hands pressed against the window as if trying to get in. I approached slowly, my breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. As I got closer, I realized the handprints were on the inside of the glass, which should have been impossible, since I was supposedly alone in the building. A sound made me turn. The supply closet door stood open. I ran down the hallway, taking the stairs 2 at a time, not stopping until I reached my classroom. Only then did I realize I was clutching something in my hand, a piece of heavy cardboard, exactly what Emma had needed for her project. I placed it on my desk with shaking hands. Attached to it was a child's drawing done in crayon, 7 stick figures holding hands on a mountain peak. In the corner, written in shaky letters, was a name, Patricia Blackfeet. Tommy's great aunt, the little girl who had died in the blizzard nearly 60 years ago. The next morning, I brought Emma her cardboard without mentioning where I'd gotten it. She completed her project successfully and even won the science fair. But I noticed something troubling in the following days. She had started drawing mountains again. Not Old Baldy this time, but a different peak. One with 7 small figures dancing near the summit. When I asked her about it, she smiled. "They're not scary, Mr. Ellis. They just want friends. They get lonely up there in the cold." I destroyed the drawing immediately, as Rule 4 required. But that night I dreamed of 7 children singing in the snow, calling to their classmates below. In the dream, I understood their song. It was beautiful and sad, and full of longing for warmth and companionship. I woke up with frost on my bedroom windows, even though the heat had been running all night. And I could swear I heard children's laughter echoing from the mountains, carrying on the wind like a promise or a threat. That weekend, I carefully reread all the rules. Rule 3 wasn't just about avoiding the supply closet. It was about ensuring certain doors remained closed during the season when the boundary between the living and dead grew thinnest. I had already opened one door. Now I had to live with what might have followed me through it. December brought the first real storm of the season. The Weather Service had been tracking it for days, a massive system rolling down from Canada that promised to dump 3 feet of snow on the valley. By Tuesday morning, it was clear we were in for the fight of the winter. School started normally enough. The heating system cranked at full capacity, fighting off the Arctic air seeping through every gap in the old building's defenses. Outside, snow fell in thick curtains, making the mountains disappear and reappear like ghosts in the white void. I watched my students carefully. Since the supply closet incident, several had begun exhibiting strange behaviors. Emma had started leaving small offerings on her windowsill, bits of her lunch, drawings folded into origami birds, once even a pencil broken precisely in half. When I asked her about it, she said it was for the cold children. Tommy had grown quiet, often staring out the windows toward old Baldy when he thought I wasn't looking. Sarah Fletcher, one of the twins, had begun collecting ice crystals, examining them with a magnifying glass, and claiming she could see faces in their patterns. By 1:30 p.m., the storm had intensified beyond all predictions. The lights flickered as wind hammered the building. Principal Henderson's voice crackled over the intercom. "All staff, prepare for early dismissal. Buses will begin loading in 15 minutes. But as we organized backpacks and winter gear, the lights went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting the hallway in hellish red shadows. The heating system died with a mechanical wheeze that echoed through the building. I thought of Rule 5. During blizzards, if the power goes out, gather all children in the music room. Do not use candles or flashlights. Darkness is safer. Everyone leave your things, I said quickly. We need to go to the music room. Why the music room? Asked Michael Fletcher, Tommy's seatmate. Because that's where we're supposed to go. I counted my students, 23, all present. Single file, hold hands. Tommy, you're line leader. The hallway was chaos. Other teachers shepherded their classes toward the music room, everyone following protocols they hoped never to use. The emergency lights cast everything in eerie red shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Mrs. Peterson passed us with his second-grade class. "Power's out all over the county," he called. "Phone lines, too." We reached the music room to find it already crowded with classes. Mrs. Albright was there, though she'd been retired for 2 years. She caught my eye and nodded toward the piano. "Stack the chairs," she said quietly. "All the children sit on the floor, backs to the center. They shouldn't face the walls." I helped organize the space, noticing that every teacher who'd been at the school more than 5 years seemed to know exactly what to do. The newer teachers, like me, followed their lead with growing unease. As we settled in, the storm outside reached a crescendo. Wind howled around the building with voices that almost sounded human. The music room's windows were covered with heavy curtains, not the usual classroom type, but thick fabric that blocked out all light from outside. Mrs. Kowalski, the secretary and Emma's mother, had arrived from the office carrying the school's emergency radio. The static was overwhelming, but occasionally voices broke through. Other schools reporting similar power outages, emergency services stretched thin, and something that made my blood run cold. Reports of children walking along highways in the storm, disappearing when vehicles approached. "Mr. Ellis," Emma whispered. She was sitting between Tommy and Sarah, all 3 of them facing inward, as instructed. "Do you hear them singing?" I listened. Above the storm's roar, there was something else. Not quite singing, not quite crying. It seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Everyone stay facing center," I said loudly enough for all my students to hear. "No matter what you hear or think you see, keep your eyes on each other." The temperature in the room plummeted. I watched my breath fog in the red emergency lighting and felt ice crystals forming on the windows despite the curtains. The singing grew louder, sweet, and beckoning. That's when Sarah Fletcher turned toward the wall. "Sarah, no." I reached for her, but she was already standing, eyes wide and unfocused. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "The Ice Children. They want us to dance with them." The curtain nearest her began to move despite the lack of any breeze in the room. Behind it, shadows shifted. Not dancing, exactly, but swaying in rhythm with the ethereal music. Mrs. Albright appeared beside me. "Don't let her reach the wall," she said urgently. "If she touches the glass, they can pull her through." I grabbed Sarah's shoulders just as her fingertips brushed the curtain. She felt solid for a moment, then began to fade. Actually fade, like a photograph being bleached by sunlight. "Help me!" I shouted. Tommy and Michael Fletcher grabbed their sister's arms. The moment they touched her, she solidified again, but the cold that radiated from her was stunning. "Ice!" she gasped. "So much ice. They're trapped in the ice." We pulled her back to the center of the room. She collapsed, shivering violently. Mrs. Albright produced a thermos of hot chocolate from somewhere and made Sarah drink it in small sips. "How many?" Mrs. Albright asked quietly. "7," Sarah answered, though no one had explained what that meant. "Always 7. They take turns being leader of the dance." The singing faded gradually as Sarah warmed up. The storm continued to rage, but inside the music room, the atmosphere shifted from supernatural dread to more ordinary fear of being snowed in. Hours passed. Eventually, the storm began to weaken. The power remained out, but the emergency radio crackled with better news. The highways were being cleared, though slowly. By 7 p.m., generators had been brought in to restore basic power. The heat came back on, and we began to pack up. But as we left the music room, Mrs. Albright pulled me aside. "That child saw them clearly," she said. "The Ice Children. They're more active this year than they've been in decades." "Because I opened the supply closet," I said. It wasn't a question. She nodded soberly. "You created a small breach. Nothing permanent, but enough to let them sense more of our world. They're curious about the living children now." As I helped load my students onto the buses, Sarah Fletcher grabbed my sleeve. Her eyes were clearer now, but haunted. "Mr. Ellis," she said, "they asked me to give you a message." "What message?" "They said thank you for bringing them the cardboard. They used it to make boats." "Boats?" "To sail down the mountain when it melts. They said they'll visit in spring." The bus doors closed, and I watched it disappear into the blowing snow. Principal Henderson appeared beside me, holding 2 flashlights. "Building sweep," he said. "Make sure everyone's out." We walked through the school together, checking classrooms. Everything seemed normal until we reached the 2nd floor. The supply closet door stood ajar, and scratch marks scored the wood around the handle. Inside, we could see evidence of small hands rearranging the supplies. Stacks of paper formed into careful spirals, wooden rulers arranged in complex geometric patterns. And in the center of the closet, 7 origami boats made from heavy cardboard. "They're learning," Henderson said quietly. "Learning what?" "How to exist in our world. Your breach gave them access to physical materials. Now they're experimenting." We backed away from the closet, and Henderson locked it with 3 different keys. "From now until March," he said. "That door stays sealed, no exceptions." That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside my apartment, the settling of snow, the creak of tree branches, seemed to carry the echo of children's voices. Around midnight, I looked out my window and saw them. 7 small figures walking single file through the snow, moving toward the school. I blinked, and they were gone. But their footprints remained, glowing faintly blue in the starlight, leading from Old Baldy toward the school building. The prints were small, unmistakably those of children, and they didn't quite touch the ground. I closed the curtains and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. The barrier between the living and dead had been thinned, and the ice children were growing bolder. Spring was still months away, but already they were making plans. Plans that involved my students, my school, and a debt I had inadvertently created when I opened a door that was meant to stay closed. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of children laughing, mixed with something else. The scrape of small fingers against glass, testing the strength of windows, looking for another way in. The weeks following the blizzard passed in a haze of watchful tension. I found myself developing a 6th sense for the supernatural, a cold prickle at the base of my skull whenever something wasn't quite right. The children had changed too, becoming more sensitive to things beyond the visible world. It was January 15th when I captured the first photograph. I'd started carrying a disposable camera after the blizzard, hoping to document evidence of what we were experiencing. Film seemed more reliable than digital for things that shouldn't exist. That Tuesday afternoon, as I prepared to leave the building, I noticed the music room door standing open. No one should have been inside. I approached cautiously, remembering every warning I'd received. Through the gap, I could see someone sitting at the piano. Small hands moved across the keys without making sound, pressing them in complex patterns that seemed too advanced for any of our students. I raised the camera and took a picture before thinking better of it. The flash illuminated a child sitting at the piano bench, a boy in old-fashioned clothes, maybe 8 years old, with dark hair and eyes that reflected the flash like an animal's. For one terrible moment, he looked directly at me, and I saw recognition there. Not surprise, but acknowledgement, as if we'd been properly introduced. Then he smiled. I ran. When I developed the film that weekend, the image showed an empty piano bench, but the keys were depressed in a complex chord. More disturbing were the other photos I hadn't remembered taking. Images of children I didn't recognize scattered throughout the school halls, standing in doorways, sitting at desks in empty classrooms. All appeared normal except for their eyes, which glowed with reflected light, like nocturnal creatures. Monday brought a new challenge. Tommy Blackfeet didn't come to school. His mother called around noon, her voice tight with worry. "He left for school this morning as usual," she explained to Principal Henderson while I listened on the extension. But when I drove up to check on something I'd forgotten, his teacher said he never arrived. "Which way does he walk?" Henderson asked, though we all knew the answer. Tommy lived on the north side of town, near the old mining road that wound up toward the peaks. The same way he always does, past the cultural center, through the cemetery, and down Main Street. Henderson and I exchanged glances. The cemetery. Of course. Mrs. Blackfeet agreed to meet us there. We found her truck parked at the small Native American section, where weathered headstones marked graves dating back to the early 1900s. She stood before a particular marker, tears freezing on her cheeks. Patricia Blackfeet, 1953 to 1961, Henderson read aloud, Tommy's great aunt. "He comes here sometimes," Mrs. Blackfeet said, "leaves things for her. His grandmother taught him the old ways, said family spirits need remembering." But this morning was different. There were other children here. I saw them from the road. Other children. 7 of them, making a circle around Patricia's grave. They were holding hands and humming. She pointed toward the headstone. Look at the snow. Around Patricia's grave, the snow had been disturbed in perfect circular patterns. 7 sets of small footprints formed an intricate spiral, converging on the headstone where fresh offerings had been placed: candy bars, a small toy truck, and one of Tommy's characteristic beadwork bracelets. But no sign of Tommy himself. We searched for hours. The entire town turned out, following Tommy's usual route, checking every building and hiding spot. As afternoon shadows lengthened, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The search parties were finding 7 sets of child-sized footprints in the snow, but only 6 were Tommy's. The other 6 led away from town, up toward the mountains. They were smaller than Tommy's, wearing what looked like old-fashioned boots based on the print patterns. And most disturbing of all, they sometimes walked perfectly synchronized, like a group of children holding hands and stepping in unison. By sunset, we'd found no trace of Tommy. The search expanded to include rescue teams from Kalispell and Glacier National Park. But as darkness fell, Mrs. Blackfeet made a decision that horrified everyone. "I'm going to camp in the cemetery tonight," she announced. "Traditional ways. Sometimes the spirits will return what they've borrowed if you wait properly." Henderson tried to dissuade her, but she was resolute. Eventually, he agreed to let me stay with her, along with Sheriff Martinez and a deputy. We set up a watch rotation, keeping a small fire burning near Patricia's grave. The temperature dropped to well below 0. Around midnight, during my watch, I heard it, singing. Not the ethereal chorus from the school, but a single clear voice, young and strong. It came from the direction of Old Baldy, floating down on the still air like a prayer. Mrs. Blackfeet woke instantly. "That's him," she whispered. "That's Tommy." The singing continued for perhaps 10 minutes, a traditional Blackfeet lullaby that Mrs. Blackfeet quietly translated for us. The words spoke of children coming home, of spirits protecting the innocent, of the connection between the living and the ancestors. When the song ended, silence returned, but it was different now, expectant rather than empty. "Look," the deputy breathed. 7 figures approached through the trees. In the firelight, they appeared to be children, but their movements were strange, too fluid, too synchronized. They formed a circle around the grave, just beyond our small fire's reach. Tommy walked among them, but his eyes were vacant, unfocused. He moved like someone sleepwalking, guided by invisible hands. "Tommy," Mrs. Blackfeet called softly. "It's time to come home." One of the 7 children stepped forward. Even in the flickering firelight, I could see it was the boy from the piano, the one I had photographed. He spoke, and his voice carried clearly despite being barely above a whisper. He danced with us. He knows the old songs. We like him. "He belongs with the living," Mrs. Blackfeet replied, standing slowly. "Patricia's time was 60 years ago. This boy's time is now." "Lonely," the boy said. "So lonely in the ice." Mrs. Blackfeet began to sing, not the lullaby Tommy had been singing, but something older, in the original Blackfeet language. I didn't understand the words, but I felt their power. The temperature around us rose noticeably. The 7 children wavered, their forms becoming less solid. But they didn't retreat. "Trade," the boy suggested. "Keep the singer. Give back the warm one." "No trades," Mrs. Blackfeet said firmly. "Tommy returns." Now. What happened next defied explanation. Mrs. Blackfeet reached into her coat and pulled out something I hadn't seen her carrying. a small medicine bundle wrapped in hide. She opened it carefully, revealing what looked like dried herbs, small bones, and other items I couldn't identify. She threw a pinch of the contents into our fire, and the flames turned blue-white, blazing higher than should have been possible. The 7 children stepped back as one, releasing Tommy. He stumbled toward the fire, blinking as if waking from a deep sleep. Mrs. Blackfeet caught him in her arms, and I watched as warmth returned to his eyes, replacing the vacant stare. "The mountains are lonely," he said, his voice his own again. "They wanted me to stay and sing with them forever." The 7 children began to fade, but the boy from the piano spoke once more. "Spring comes soon. When the snow melts, we'll have boats." They vanished completely, leaving only the wind in the pines and the crackle of our fire. We returned to town just before dawn, Tommy wrapped in blankets and his mother's arms. He seemed physically fine, though he couldn't remember much of his time with the Ice Children. But he did retain one thing: the ability to sing their songs. Over the following days, I noticed he would hum them unconsciously, especially during art class. And when he hummed, other students would begin drawing mountains. Always the same mountain, always with 7 tiny figures dancing on the peak. I destroyed the drawings each time, but they kept appearing. Even more troubling was that the students were drawing them in greater detail now, able to capture faces, expressions, individual characteristics of the 7 children. Emma had developed the most precise artistic ability. Her drawings showed the boy from the piano wearing a name tag that read Michael K., 1961. Another child wore clothing that clearly marked her as Patricia Blackfeet. The Ice Children weren't a knot on the spirits anymore. They were individuals with names, histories, identities. And according to Tommy's faint memories, they were planning something for when the snow gave way to spring rain. Something that involved the boats they were building in the spirit world, and the connections they were forging with our students. As February arrived with its false promises of warmer days, I began to understand that we were approaching the most dangerous time of year. The Ice Children had spent the winter learning about us, studying our routines, forming bonds with specific children. Spring would bring the test of whether our rules, our vigilance, and our determination would be enough to keep the world of the living separate from the world of the lost. The score was 7-23, for now. March arrived with a deceptive warmth that had everyone in Clearwater Falls talking about an early spring. The mountains began shedding their winter coats in daily increments, patches of dark rock showing through the snow, icicles dripping like tears from the school's eaves. But with the thaw came new problems. I noticed it first on March 3rd. Emma had arrived at school carrying a small, gift-wrapped box, the kind used for jewelry. She placed it carefully on her desk, then spent the morning sneaking glances at it. "What's in the box, Emma?" I asked during our math lesson. "Nothing important," she said, but her fingers kept hovering over it protectively. During recess, while the children played outside, I saw her through the window. She'd taken the box to the edge of the playground, near where the schoolyard met the tree line. 7 figures met her there, translucent in the bright sunlight, but unmistakably the Ice Children. Emma opened the box and pulled out something small and glittering. Even from the 3rd-floor window, I could see it was a piece of jewelry, maybe a bracelet or necklace. She held it out, and one of the Ice Children stepped forward to accept it. The exchange lasted only seconds. Then the Ice Children melted away like morning mist, and Emma returned to the playground as if nothing had happened. That afternoon, during our science lesson about erosion and weather patterns, Emma raised her hand. "Mr. Ellis," she said, "what happens when things that are frozen finally get warm again?" Well, They melt and change state from solid to liquid. But what about things that were frozen in between states, like not quite alive and not quite dead? A chill ran through the classroom despite the warming weather. Several students looked uncomfortable, and Tommy started humming one of his mountain songs, a nervous habit he'd developed since his experience with the Ice Children. "Emma," I said carefully, "where is this question coming from?" "Just curious." But her eyes were distant, unfocused. The same expression Sarah Fletcher had worn during the blizzard. That evening, Principal Henderson called a meeting of all staff, plus Mrs. Blackfeet and several other community members. We gathered in the library after hours, the familiar space feeling anything but comfortable. "The Ice Children are becoming more active," Henderson began without preamble. "We've had reports from the bus drivers, the janitor, several families. They're moving around in daylight now, and they're interacting with our students outside school grounds." Mrs. Albright, who'd been coming to the school more frequently since the blizzard, nodded grimly. "They're getting stronger. The boundaries are weakening as the snow melts." "What do you mean, boundaries?" asked Ms. Peterson, our newest teacher. "For most of the year, the Ice Children are locked in their frozen state," Mrs. Blackfeet explained. "Winter keeps them solid, contained. But as spring comes, they become more fluid, more able to affect our world." Sheriff Martinez consulted a notebook. "We've had 5 reports this week of children sleepwalking toward the mountains, all turned back or woken up before getting far, but the pattern is worrying." "Has anyone actually seen them interact with the Ice Children?" I asked, thinking of Emma's exchange. "Several parents have reported their children talking to invisible friends who know things they shouldn't," Henderson replied. Mrs. Kowalski found Emma having a conversation with her dead Uncle Michael, asking him about life in the 1960s, getting historically accurate answers. The room fell silent. Michael Kowalski was one of the 7 lost children from 1961. "We need new protocols," Mrs. Albright declared. "The old rules assumed the Ice Children stayed put during their active season. But they're mobile now, and they're targeting specific students." "Like who?" Sheriff Martinez asked. "Children with family connections to the lost ones," Mrs. Blackfeet said. "Tommy, Emma, the Fletcher twins, children with artistic or musical abilities, and..." She paused, looking at me. "Children who've been exposed to rule violations." All eyes turned to me. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "You mean my supply closet incident?" "That breach created a connection," Henderson confirmed. "Every student in your class has been somewhat awakened to supernatural presence." Mrs. Albright stood and distributed handwritten papers to each of us. "Emergency amendments to the rules," she announced. "Effective immediately. Emergency rules, March 2024. Rule 9. No student should be alone outdoors before sunrise or after sunset, regardless of parent permission. Rule 10. If a child brings unusual gifts to school, jewelry, toys they don't remember receiving, artwork they can't explain creating, confiscate immediately and burn completely. Rule 11. Teachers must perform morning and afternoon head counts. Any discrepancy must be reported immediately, even if you can account for all present students. Rule 12. The music room will be staffed 24/7 through spring equinox. Teachers will rotate shifts. 24-hour supervision? I asked. Why? Because, Henderson explained, the Ice Children have been seen gathering there at night. We think they're using it as a crossing point between worlds. They're practicing. Practicing for what? Mrs. Blackfeet answered. Traditional stories speak of spirits that can take the place of the living if the conditions are right. But they need practice to inhabit physical bodies correctly. Over the following week, we implemented the new rules. the 24-hour supervision proved immediately necessary. During my night shift, from midnight to 6 a.m., I witnessed things that challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. The ice children didn't just appear. They materialized slowly, like photographs developing in darkroom chemicals. First, vague shapes in the shadows, then recognizable forms. Finally, children so solid-looking they could have been students arriving early. They would sit in various spots around the music room, on the piano bench, at the small tables, even on the floor in circles. They didn't speak to me directly, but they would nod politely when I looked at them, as if acknowledging a teacher's presence. Most unsettling was how they imitated normal classroom behavior. The boy I'd come to know as Michael would practice piano fingerings, silently but with perfect technique. Patricia Blackfeet would arrange invisible art supplies on a table, going through the motions of creating something. The others would sit in a circle, apparently playing games that involved complicated hand gestures and silent laughter. They were learning to be alive. On March 15th, during my afternoon shift, Emma appeared in the music room doorway. School had ended 2 hours earlier, and all students should have been home. "Emma? How did you get back in the building?" She smiled, but it wasn't her usual expression. It was too practiced, too perfect. "The children let me in, Mr. Ellis. They want to show me something." Behind her, I could see 7 translucent figures crowding in the doorway. They looked more solid than usual, more real. Michael stepped forward. "We've been practicing," he said, his voice clearer than I'd ever heard it. "We're almost ready." "Ready for what?" Emma answered, though I was sure the words weren't her own. "To come home properly. To attend classes like we should have." That's when I realized the horrible truth. The ice children weren't trying to take our students away. They were trying to take their places. "Emma, you need to come with me, right now." "But they've been teaching me things," she protested. "How to see the world differently, how to move between the warm places and the cold places." I approached her carefully, noting how her breath formed clouds despite the room's comfortable temperature. When I touched her shoulder, she felt cold. Not winter coat cold, but morning frost cold. "Emma," I said firmly, "you need to remember who you are. You're Emma Kowalski. You live on the ranch with your parents. You love math and art and your horse bell." For a moment, her expression wavered. The too perfect smile faded, replaced by confusion. "Mr. Ellis? Where am I?" I was supposed to go home after school. The 7 ice children faded slightly, their forms becoming less definite. I led Emma quickly from the music room, calling Principal Henderson as we walked. She seemed to return to normal by the time we reached the main office, with no memory of how she'd gotten back into the building. But that night, I reviewed the security footage from the day. At 3:47 p.m., the camera showed Emma leaving normally with her classmates. At 4:23 p.m., it showed her entering through the front door, except the person entering looked subtly wrong. Her movements were too coordinated, her posture too erect. At 4:45 p.m., the same door opened again, and a child who looked exactly like Emma walked out. For 21 minutes, there had been 2 Emmas in the building. The real one in the music room with me, and another one somewhere else, doing things I didn't want to contemplate. The ice children weren't just practicing being alive anymore. They were practicing being specific people. As March drew toward its end and the last snow retreated to the highest peaks, I realized we were approaching a moment of crisis. The spring equinox was only days away, and according to Mrs. Blackfeet's traditional knowledge, it marked a time when the barriers between worlds grew thinnest. On March 18th, I found 7 origami boats in my classroom, made from heavy cardboard and folded with precision no child should possess. They sat on the windowsill, facing old Baldy, as if waiting for the signal to sail down the mountain. That same day, Emma, Tommy, and the Fletcher twins all asked the same question at different times. Mr. Ellis, what would happen if someone who was supposed to be dead got a chance to be alive again? I gave them vague answers about hypothetical situations, but each question carried in weight that settled in my stomach like a stone. 3 days until the spring equinox. 3 days until the ice children would try to trade places with the living. And I was starting to realize that our old rules might not be enough to stop them. March 20th dawned gray and heavy, the kind of day that seemed to press down on everyone's shoulders. The spring equinox would arrive at 5:27 p.m., less than 12 hours away. I hadn't slept well in days, plagued by dreams of children walking toward mountains with their faces turned backward. School felt different that morning. 7 students were absent, exactly 7, though they were scattered across different grades and families. Principal Henderson spent the morning making phone calls, tracking down each missing child. They all had variations of the same excuse. They'd woken up feeling strange, experienced vivid dreams about dancing in cold places, or simply refused to come to school without being able to explain why. By noon, 3 of the absent students had been found. Their parents brought them to school personally, noting how their children seemed confused about where they'd spent the morning. One parent mentioned finding their daughter outside in the backyard at sunrise, building small figures out of snow that shouldn't have existed in the warming weather. Emma attended classes but remained oddly focused on the windows. During writing time, she wrote the same sentence over and over. The boats sail down when the light balances the dark. "What boats, Emma?" I asked. "The ones Uncle Michael made," she said without looking up from her paper. "He's very good with paper now." In the afternoon, the sky darkened despite the season. Clouds built up around Old Baldy with unnatural speed, though the weather service had predicted clear skies. By 3 p.m., snow had begun falling again. Not the heavy, wet snow of spring, but the sharp, crystalline flakes of deepest winter. During the last period of the day, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Tommy Blackfeet was in art class, working on a watercolor painting, but his brush moved without him dipping it in water or paint. Colors appeared on the paper, seemingly from nowhere. Blues and whites forming intricate mountain landscapes with 7 small figures descending what looked like a frozen waterfall. "Tommy," I said quietly, approaching his desk, "what are you painting?" He looked up, startled, as if he'd been somewhere else entirely. I don't know, Mr. Ellis. I wasn't even painting. I was listening." "Listening to what?" "The singing. It's everywhere now." As if summoned by his words, I heard it too. Faint but growing stronger, the ethereal chorus I'd learned to dread. This time, though, it wasn't coming from empty classrooms or the second floor. It seemed to emanate from the building itself, from the walls and windows, and the very air we breathed. Principal Henderson's voice crackled over the intercom. "All staff, implement Protocol 7 immediately. Students remain in classrooms until further notice." Protocol 7. I read about it in the Emergency Procedures Manual but hoped never to see it used. It meant supernatural threat level critical. Basically lockdown mode with armed supervision and continuous contact with outside authorities. I guided my 23 students to the center of the room, away from windows and walls. The singing grew louder, more complex, as if multiple choirs were harmonizing from different parts of the building. That's when Sarah Fletcher raised her hand. "Mr. Ellis?" "I can see them." Through our 3rd-floor window, figures moved across the schoolyard. At first glance, they looked like normal children bundling up against the unexpected snow. But as I watched, I realized they moved in perfect unison. 7 children walking in a precise formation, each one a mirror image of the others. They reached the building and stopped directly below our window. As one, they looked up at us. 7 faces that I recognized as my own students. Emma, Tommy, both Fletcher twins, and 3 others from different classes. Perfect copies, down to the clothing they'd worn to school that morning. But their eyes held the ancient patience of things that had been waiting 60 years to live again. "Mr. Ellis," the real Emma whispered beside me. "Why do I look so cold down there?" The singing intensified. Other teachers' voices echoed through the hallway. Miss Peterson from 2nd grade calling in a panic. Mr. Jackson from kindergarten reporting that his students were acting strange, like they're listening to something we can't hear. Then the lights went out. Unlike the blizzard blackout, this wasn't gradual. One moment we had normal fluorescent lighting. The next we were plunged into absolute darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, but the red glow made everything look hellish. Protocol 7 called for specific actions during power loss. We were to move our students to the gymnasium, maintaining physical contact at all times. I organized my class into pairs, having them link arms. "No one lets go," I instructed. "If you lose contact with your partner, call out immediately." We moved through the hallways like a strange parade, passing other classes doing the same. In the red emergency lighting, every shadow seemed to hide additional figures. I counted my students obsessively. 23. Always 23. But between the 2nd and 1st floors, Tommy's partner called out, "He's gone!" Tommy just disappeared. We stopped immediately. In the crimson light, I could see the boy who'd been holding Tommy's hand. His eyes were wide with shock. He was there. Then I felt him get really cold, and then my hand was empty. I did a quick count. 22 students. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but years of teaching kicked in. Everyone take 2 steps closer together. Wink arms again. We're almost to the gym. As we resumed walking, I heard a new voice singing with the phantom chorus. Young, strong, familiar. Tommy. In the gymnasium, organized chaos reigned. Students from all grades sat in neat groups, supervised by teachers and volunteer parents who'd responded to the emergency alert. Mrs. Albright moved between groups like a general surveying troops, checking the protocols were being followed. "How many missing?" Principal Henderson asked me when I reported our arrival. 1. Tommy Blackfeet disappeared between floors. He made a note on his clipboard, his face grim. Total of 9 missing from all classes. Always the same patterns: children with family connections, artistic ability, or exposure to rule violations. The duplicates outside. We've seen them. Police have been called, but they report that when officers approach, the figures look exactly like our missing students. No way to determine which is real. Mrs. Blackfeet appeared beside us, her face etched with worry. Tommy's been taken before. He might be more resistant than the others. Sheriff Martinez joined our huddle. We're dealing with something unprecedented. Every missing child has been spotted in at least 2 locations simultaneously. We've got parents reporting their kids are home safe, while teachers insist those same kids are missing from school. The gymnasium lights flickered, causing several children to cry out. In that moment of darkness, I saw something that stopped my heart. 7 children stood in the center of the gym floor. Clear, solid, completely real-looking. They weren't translucent or ghostly. They appeared exactly like living children. When the lights steadied, they were gone. "Did everyone see?" Henderson began. "See what?" asked Mrs. Patterson, the librarian. "I didn't see anything unusual." As the afternoon progressed toward 5:27 p.m., strange reports flooded in. Parents arriving at school found their children in the parking lot, children who teachers insisted were still missing. Security cameras showed the same child entering and leaving the building multiple times, often while other cameras simultaneously recorded them in classrooms. At 5:20 p.m., with 7 minutes until the equinox, every missing child reappeared in the gymnasium. They walked in together, holding hands, looking slightly confused but otherwise normal. Parents rushed to embrace them, tears of relief streaming down faces. But I noticed something wrong. Each returned child was soaked to the skin, their clothes dripping with what looked like snow melt. Their lips had a blue tinge despite the gym's warmth, and when they spoke, small puffs of vapor accompanied their words. Tommy approached me first. "Mr. Ellis?" "I'm sorry, I wandered off. I heard the singing and I had to follow it." "Where did you go, Tommy?" "To the mountain, to see the boats." He smiled, and his smile was perfect. Too perfect. They're very beautiful boats. Uncle Michael carved them from ice. Emma appeared beside him, equally wet and cold. "We helped them practice, Mr. Ellis. They wanted to make sure they could do everything right." "Practice what?" "Being us." That's when I realized the horrible truth of what had happened during those missing hours. The ice children hadn't tried to take our students permanently. They'd brought them to the mountain for intensive training sessions, learning to perfectly mimic speech patterns, mannerisms, memories, relationships, preparing for a final exchange at the exact moment of the equinox. I glanced at the clock. 5:26 p.m., 1 minute. The singing suddenly stopped, leaving the gymnasium in silence that felt dangerous. Everyone could sense something approaching. That moment when day and night balanced perfectly, when the barriers between worlds grew thin as tissue paper. 5:27 p.m. The lights didn't go out. Instead, they brightened steadily until the gymnasium blazed with light that had no source we could identify. In that brilliant illumination, every child who'd been missing cast two shadows. One shadow attached normally to their feet. The other stood beside them, independent and waiting. As the equinox moment peaked, the shadows began to move. The moving shadows rose from the gymnasium floor, like smoke taking shape. As they solidified, I saw 7 children stepping out of the shadows of the returned students. Perfect mirror images, but these figures moved with the fluid grace of things that had never been truly alive. The gymnasium erupted in screams. Parents grabbed for their children, but I noticed something terrifying. They grabbed the wrong ones. The shadow children were indistinguishable from the originals, and in the chaos, no one could tell which was which. Mrs. Blackfeet stood at the center of the confusion, her voice cutting through the noise. "Everyone stop! Don't move. No one leave the building." The brilliant light intensified, and suddenly everything became clear. Each returned child stood perfectly still, while their shadow self moved independently. The duplicates weren't trying to escape or attack. They were simply standing there, watching their originals with expressions of profound sadness. Michael Kowalski's ice child form looked at Emma with ancient eyes. "We don't want to steal," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium. "We want to share." Tommy's shadow self nodded. 60 years is a long time to be cold. Emma stepped forward, no fear in her voice. "What do you mean, share?" "We learned to be you," Patricia Blackfeet's shadow explained, looking at Tommy. "Now you can learn to be us. Visit the cold places, see the mountain paths, understand the songs." Principal Henderson tried to intervene. "Children, step away from—" "No," Emma interrupted firmly. Let them talk. The shadow of Sarah Fletcher gestured toward the windows, where the unnatural snowfall continued. The warm world and the cold world can touch during the balance time, share memories, share experiences. But not forever, added Michael's shadow. Just visiting. Mrs. Albright approached slowly, seeming to understand something the rest of us hadn't grasped. They're not trying to replace the children. They're offering an exchange of experiences. The shadows nodded in unison. For one night, Patricia's shadow said, we can know what it's like to be warm, to have families, to learn in classrooms. And we can show them the mountain paths, added another shadow. The ice palaces, the songs that keep the cold away. The real Emma looked at her family, then back at her shadow self. Is it safe? Your teachers kept you safe with rules, Michael's shadow replied. We've learned rules too, rules for visiting. Henderson pulled me aside. This isn't in any of our protocols. What do we do? Before I could answer, Tommy stepped forward. I've seen their world. When I was taken before. It's not scary if you go willingly. Tell me, no, his mother started. Mom, they're not evil. They're just lonely and curious. He looked at his shadow self. What are these rules? The shadow Tommy smiled, an expression I'd never seen on the original's serious face. Return before sunrise. Stay together. Remember that you are living, not lost. And most important, always find your way back to the warm, concluded the shadow Emma. Mrs. Blackfeet studied the ice children carefully. Traditional stories speak of this. Soul walking, vision sharing. It was practiced long ago, before people forgot the proper ceremonies. We remembered the ceremonies, whispered the shadow Patricia. Learned them from the old ones who crossed before the mining accident. I felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. The fear was dissipating, replaced by curiosity and strange recognition. These weren't monsters or demons. They were children who'd been trapped in a moment of tragedy, finally finding a way to experience life again, without taking it from others. If we let this happen, I asked, how do we know they'll come back? How do we know this isn't an elaborate trick? Emma's shadow reached into her translucent pocket and pulled out something solid, a small beaded bracelet identical to one the real Emma wore. We made these while the living children visited the mountain, made them with ice that remembers. Wear them and you'll always find your way back to the warm. 7 bracelets appeared in the shadow's hands, each unique and beautiful. The real children looked at each other, having some silent conversation only they could understand. Finally, Emma spoke for all of them. We want to do this. Parents objected immediately, voices rising in protest. But Mrs. Blackfeet raised her hand. This is the children's choice. In traditional ways, young people sought visions to understand the world beyond the everyday. This is similar. Henderson checked his watch. How long do we have to decide? The balance lasts 1 hour, replied Shadow Tommy. After that, the way closes until next year. What followed was the strangest negotiation I'd ever witnessed. Parents arguing with shadows, children explaining their willingness to experience something beyond imagination, teachers debating supernatural protocols that didn't exist in any manual. Finally, enough consensus emerged. The 7 children would go, but with conditions. Teachers would monitor them until gone. The shadows would leave something behind as guarantee of the children's safe return. And Mrs. Blackfeet would perform a blessing to ensure the connection remained strong. As the living children accepted the ice bracelets, a transformation began. They didn't fade or disappear. Instead, they seemed to become more vivid, more present, while simultaneously gaining the translucent quality of their shadows. The shadow children solidified correspondingly, gaining weight and warmth and solid presence. Michael's shadow, now Michael himself, looked around the gymnasium with wonder. "Electric lights," he whispered. "They're so bright." Patricia touched her own face carefully, as if checking that she was real. Warm skin. I remember warm skin. The exchange children began moving toward the exits. They walked through walls without effort, but the solid children, the ice children in living bodies, had to open doors like anyone else. "We'll follow," Henderson declared. "Document everything." But as we reached the schoolyard, the walking children had already covered impossible distance. They were halfway to Old Baldy, moving up the mountain path in single file, their new shadows extending behind them like dark ribbons. The ice children in living bodies stayed with us, marveling at snow that felt cold against skin, at breath that formed clouds, at heartbeats that echoed in their ears. Hours passed. We maintained vigil in the school, tracking the children's progress as best we could. The ice children proved perfect students, asking endless questions about modern life. They were particularly fascinated by electric power, computers, and cell phones. "In our time, the most advanced technology was the radio in the principal's office," explained Michael, experimenting with turning lights on and off. As dawn approached, we all gathered in the music room, the space that had served as their crossing point all winter. 5 a.m. came and went, with no sign of the children. 5:15 a.m., still nothing. At 5:30 a.m., just as panic was beginning to set in, we heard singing. Not the ethereal chorus we'd learned to fear, but children's voices raised in joy and laughter. 7 figures appeared at the edge of the schoolyard, running through the fading snow. As they reached the building, I could see they were our original children, solid and warm and undeniably alive. They burst into the music room, faces flushed with excitement and adventure. "Mr. Ellis," Emma called breathlessly, "you should see the ice palaces. They're like libraries made of frozen starlight." "And the aurora borealis from inside the clouds," added Tommy. "We could touch it." The ice children began to shimmer as true sunrise arrived. Michael hugged Emma one final time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for letting us remember warmth." "Thank you," Emma replied, "for showing us the cold isn't always scary." As the first ray of direct sunlight entered the music room, the ice children faded gradually, peacefully, their shadow selves sinking back into the living children's shadows where they belonged. The room fell silent, except for the sound of children breathing hard from their run. "Did it really happen?" asked Sarah Fletcher. I looked around the room. On the music stand sat 7 intricate origami figures, boats made of ice that somehow remained solid despite the room's warmth. Proof of a night when 2 worlds touched and learned that sharing could heal old wounds. "Yes," I said, "it really happened." Emma pulled out a piece of paper and began sketching. But this time, she wasn't drawing mountains of menace and fear. She drew children, living and spirit, holding hands in a circle, both groups smiling. "Can we do it again next year?" she asked. I thought about rules, about safety, about the supernatural protocols we'd spent months learning. Then I looked at the joy in these children's faces, at the peace that had settled over the school. "We'll see," I said. "But if we do, we'll be better prepared." Outside, the last of the unnatural snow was melting in normal March sunshine. The ice children had returned to their mountain, carrying with them memories of warmth, friendship, and acceptance. And our children had learned that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from extending compassion to those who are different, even those who are no longer alive. The rules had served their purpose, keeping us safe until understanding could replace fear. Now maybe we could write new rules. Rules about sharing, about compassion, about the beauty found when two worlds learn they don't have to be afraid of each other. I'm writing this by candlelight, though not because the power's out. The children insist that certain stories should be told in natural light, the kind that dances and shifts like memory itself. Outside my apartment window, old Baldy stands silhouetted against stars, and I swear I can see 7 tiny figures dancing near its peak. Today marks Emma's first day of 6th grade. She walked into my classroom this morning carrying a special gift, a photograph that shouldn't exist. It shows all 30 of her classmates from last year, 23 living children and 7 ice children, all clearly visible, all smiling. The photo was taken during a moment when supposedly only the living children were present. How? I asked her. Some cameras see more than others, she replied, then added with the casual wisdom these children now carry, Michael taught me which ones. The school has officially acknowledged our supernatural students. After months of deliberation, the school board voted to create the Clearwater Falls Inclusive Education Initiative, probably the first elementary school program designed specifically for interdimensional learning. We've hired Dr. Sarah Wyndham, an anthropologist specializing in anomalous educational environments, to develop curriculum for our unique situation. My classroom now has 46 desks. The extras remain empty most days, but on certain mornings, especially when the Mountain Mother turns unusual, I'll arrive to find small chalk marks on their surfaces, evidence of overnight study sessions. Emma says the ice children prefer philosophy and poetry. They're particularly fascinated by Emily Dickinson. Last month, Tommy composed his first published song. Bridge of Seven Winters debuted at the Browning Cultural Festival and has since spread throughout the Blackfeet Nation. He claims Patricia Blackfeet helped with the traditional vocables, teaching him sounds that predate European contact. The tribal council is documenting everything, calling it the returning knowledge. The Fletcher twins have opened the first gallery in Clearwater Falls. Their exhibition, Expressions from the Cold, features collaborative works created by living and spirit children. The paintings sell to collectors from across the country, though none understand that half of each piece was painted by ghosts. I've learned to read the signs of their presence. Pencil shavings arranged in perfect spirals on my desk. Multiplication problems solved in handwriting that belongs to no living student. The scent of winter roses in an overheated classroom. Mrs. Albright stopped by yesterday with a manila folder thick with reports. Similar incidents at 13 schools, she announced, settling into a chair with the satisfaction of someone whose theories had been vindicated. Missoula, Helena, even as far as Bozeman. Something changed when you opened that supply closet, David. The boundaries are shifting everywhere. We're planning a statewide conference for November. Paranormal pedagogy in rural education sounds official enough to secure funding while acknowledging the reality we're facing. Dr. Wyndham will present our model as a framework other schools can adapt. The most significant change is in me. I wake up excited for work again, knowing each day brings new discoveries. Yesterday, during a lesson on ecosystems, a student asked about ecosystem spirits. Before I could deflect, one of the ice children, visible to me now, though not to all students, raised her hand to answer. Her explanation of mineral consciousness and mountain memory was more sophisticated than anything in our science textbooks. I'm dating someone now. Margaret Santos, the new librarian who replaced Mrs. Patterson. She transferred here from Denver, drawn by reports of our unique teaching environment. On our third date, she casually mentioned seeing children in the library after hours, reorganizing books according to systems she didn't recognize. The fiction section was arranged by the emotional resonance of the stories. she told me over coffee. Everything that dealt with loss and longing in one area, tales of wonder in another. It's actually brilliant. She's helped me understand that what we experienced wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The Ice Children aren't trapped ghosts, but pioneers, showing us that consciousness exists in more forms than we'd imagined. Next week begins our second annual Spring Equinox Exchange program. This year, 11 children have signed up, including 3 transfers from other schools, whose parents specifically moved here for the opportunity. We've created permission forms that would terrify most lawyers. I understand that my child will participate in interdimensional educational activities and may temporarily exist as a translucent spiritual entity. Every form came back signed. Tonight I'll leave small offerings on my windowsill. Pieces of my mother's jewelry, letters to friends I've lost, poems I've written about loneliness. By morning, they'll be gone, replaced by ice crystals that hold memories of laughter, snowflakes that smell like pine and wood smoke, and sometimes notes written in careful cursive. Thank you for teaching us that alone and lonely are different things. Teaching in Clearwater Falls has taught me that education extends beyond the visible curriculum. We're all learning here. The living from the dead, the warm from the cold, the possible from the impossible. Class begins at 8 a.m. I'll be there early, as always, counting desks and wondering which will be occupied by children whose heartbeats I can hear, and which by children whose presence I feel in other ways. In this town of 800 living souls and 7 dancing ones, I've learned that the most important math has never been about addition or subtraction. It's about multiplication. How one open door can multiply possibilities beyond calculation. How understanding can multiply where fear once divided. How love can multiply across the barriers between worlds. My students, all 46 of them, taught me that.